You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
You'll see that we're somewhere a little different today as we join you live from Bloomberg CityLab's 2023 event in downtown Washington, D.C., gathering mayors, innovators, and business leaders from all over the country at a time of chaos here in the nation's capital. And over the next 2 hours, we'll be joined by city leaders from across the nation, from Allentown, Pennsylvania to Fort Collins, Colorado. So stay with us. We have a lot to learn and a lot to cover here the next 2 hours. We start, though, with an update on Capitol Hill. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines has been there for a couple of hours as things shift under Jim Jordan's feet. And Kaylee, it looks like the Republican from Ohio is out of the running for Speaker. What's the latest?
Yeah, he's not taking himself out of the running entirely, Joe. What he is trying to support is temporarily giving more power to the Speaker Pro Tem, Patrick McHenry, so that he can try to continue whipping votes that he will need to actually get the gavel. There's a number of different proposals on the table. We understand that the GOP conference is actually still meeting in the basement of the Capitol, trying to hammer all of this out. One proposal on the table is from Congressman Joyce. It would empower McHenry through January 3rd. There's another on the table, though, from Mike Flood, which would actually give McHenry full power of the speakership, but for a shorter period of time until November 30th. There are a number of representatives who came out who spoke with reporters who have suggested they do not like this plan. Tim Burchett, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ralph Norman, just to name a few, are not on board. So it's going to come down to the math here. It's not clear, Joe, that that kind of resolution has the support within the Republican conference. Then it would be up, of course, to the Democrats to see if something like that could get done.
So help me understand this, help all of our listeners and viewers here, Kaylee, because when you and I were talking at this time yesterday, we thought there was going to be a third round. That's not happening now. Your point is that Jim Jordan essentially will stand in the wings while Patrick McHenry gets the hard work done as an empowered temporary speaker. And then what? There's another election, say in January, whenever that period ends?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Joe. To put it in the words of Congressman Tim Burchett from Tennessee, who was just speaking to me and a couple other reporters, he thinks this is just essentially kicking the can down the road, but in some ways it kind of is. Empower McHenry to do the work of the House in the interim term, things that need to get done, like funding the government past November 17th, trying to get potentially a supplemental package with funding for Israel through Congress as well. And in the meantime, behind the scenes, Jim Jordan will be trying to garner the support he needs to actually get the full speakership. So that seems to be the plan, but again, it's unclear at this time whether or not that plan will move forward. My understanding from speaking to members in the hallway is that they're going to try to sort this out to some degree behind closed doors before taking anything to the floor. So it remains very unclear whether we'll see anything heading to the floor today.
Wow. Really amazing stuff here, Kaylee. And of course, that means funding for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border, as we've discussed, coming together into one piece of legislation. We'll just have to wait. The president's speaking to the nation tonight to make the case for it, but there's no one to receive the bill.
Well, that's exactly right. It's going to have a hard time getting congressional approval when there's only one chamber of Congress at the moment that is actually functioning. The Senate seems eager to move on that, Joe, but of course the House is a different question, which comes back to the idea of if they can't coalesce around one individual who at this time can get 217 votes, which it seems at the moment Jim Jordan cannot, that McHenry needs to be able to act in that way to do that. But a lot of these members who are opposed to the idea think this is unconstitutional, that it may set a bad precedent despite the need to actually get things done in the House. It's just not something it seems that they can support. So they're still trying to figure out a way forward here to just be in a position to be able to pass that kind of supplemental request. Actually getting members to vote for something that includes funding for Ukraine, for example, is going to be an entirely different story that either a more powerful Patrick McHenry in a temporary role or ultimately a House Speaker is going to have the job of trying to do.
Pretty remarkable. Kaylee, it's great to see you. Thanks for the update. Great work today on the Hill, and I'll meet you back in the Bureau a little bit later on. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines, who's normally with us here on the broadcast, but we're on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue as I join you from the Waldorf in downtown D.C., which today is hosting Bloomberg CityLab's 2023 event, and we're surrounded by a lot of people who work for government, elected officials who do not have the luxury of this kind of, well, I guess we'll say politics, that we're seeing in Washington. They have to deal with real matters in real time. Those are the mayors of towns and cities across the country, many of whom we're going to meet over the next 2 hours, beginning right now with Mayor Jeni Arndt, Democrat from Fort Collins, Colorado. Welcome to Washington. It's great to see you.
Well, thanks for having me,
And thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg Radio. You just heard Kaylee describe the madness that's happening just blocks away from here. And I wonder, first of all, what you're hearing from folks in Fort Collins when they watch the news, read the papers, go online and read stories that just don't seem to make sense.
Well, they fundamentally think Washington is broken, and I think that we can see that it is right now. And hopefully we all hope for the best. And in the meantime, we continue with our work at the city.
So tell me what people are talking about and what you're focused on right now, because we're speaking a different language here inside the bubble.
That's right. Well, one of the advantages we have in city government, our city government, is you introduced me as a Democrat, and I am lifelong.
Yeah.
But we run on a nonpartisan basis in Fort Collins, so we don't have that sort of divide pulling us and pushing us in different directions. I think that's an advantage of some cities run that way. Right now, we're just in the middle of a housing crisis. Fort Collins is the third most expensive housing market outside the coasts in the United States. So we have restrictive occupancy limits. We call it U+2. Just you and two other people can live in a house. And we have a 35,000 person university, Colorado State University, in our city. So we have occupancy restrictions, and then we have a lot of restrictions on building. And right now, Tuesday night, I had to miss the first part of CityLab because I was up taking the second vote on creating more housing in Fort Collins. And I just read right before I came down here, we passed it last year. There was a citizens initiative to have it repealed. That they were successful. We passed it again on Tuesday. And I just read right now that they're trying to repeal it again.
Well, gee, and here we are with nearly 8% mortgage rates on a 30-year mortgage. This is very real for people who are, particularly young people who are trying to buy into the housing market. Does that make it more difficult to draw workers to Fort Collins?
Oh, it is
in a growing economy?
It's one of the least climate awareness things we can do is to block people out of our city, yet ask them to come in and be our police officers, our teachers, our nurses. We're closing and consolidating schools. At the same time, our city is growing. So we are fundamentally not attracting or being able to have people affordably live in our town.
You reached first for the housing market, which is fascinating to me, and it leads us directly into interest rates, which brings me to inflation. We hear about it every day here as almost an abstract in Washington. We, of course, are a data company here. We pore over this stuff on a daily basis at Bloomberg. But bring it home for me in a way that we might not hear conversations in Washington apply. How much do you hear about higher prices making life difficult beyond housing, but just day-to-day needs?
Sure. Also on Tuesday night, so recent red hot, we just increased our utility rates. I mean, those things are real bills that go to real people every month. And of course it hits the least among us the hardest because they have to pay a higher percentage of their income on utilities. Yeah. So we increase power and water. So these are real things.
So what are you getting from Washington or not getting from Washington? We talk a lot about infrastructure and investments through the Inflation Reduction Act that are bringing investments to cities like yours. But you might not have a relationship with your member of Congress that supports those ideas.
I do. I have Joe Goose is our congressional representative, and we have two wonderful senators from Colorado. Yeah. We work really closely together. Sometimes Fort Collins doesn't get the grants other communities do because as a wealthy community, we have already sponsored some of these initiatives on our own. And you know what? I'm fine with that. If there's another community that needs it more than we do, I think it should go there. But we have been successful in federal grants in our bus rapid transit and other things.
You have another member of Congress in Colorado, Lauren Boebert, who's been making some waves and making some news.
Yes, sir.
Will she still have that seat following the election?
We're trying everything we can to restore the reputation and the good representation for the people of Colorado. Yeah.
Is that a talker, as we say? Is that an issue on the table for people in Colorado to the extent that it is the sort of tabloid political media?
Yes.
It is?
Yes, and I'm very familiar. I was in the legislature for 7 years, and I have a lot of West Slope colleagues. And although it's a more conservative part of our state, everyone deserves to be represented.
Yeah. I'm glad you joined us. Thanks for being with us, and I wish you luck at CityLab here. I hope it's a productive visit.
It is.
To the nation's capital. Absolutely. Mayor Jeni Arndt with us from Fort Collins, Colorado.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, and glad you're with us here on Bloomberg Sound On as we add the voice now of Mayor Aftab Pureval. It's wonderful to see you from the great city of Cincinnati. Welcome to Washington.
Thank you so much for having me.
What brings you to CityLab, first of all? I've been talking to various mayors from around the country, and everyone seems to have a different issue or a different agenda in a way that you can make this event productive.
Yeah, we have been really fortunate to be the recipient of extraordinary investment from Bloomberg Philanthropies and a whole host of issues, but predominantly in closing the racial wealth gap in Cincinnati and using data in order to do it. We partnered with Bloomberg to study a year-long study of the barriers to wealth generation amongst Cincinnatians, specifically black Cincinnatians, and that year-long process resulted in recommendations on how to mitigate the damage and also improve wealth generation in specifically our black and historically black neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And the data is very, very clear that if you invest dollars into programs that put money into the hands of people who need it most, the results are transformative. And so with Bloomberg, we were able to pass baby bonds for all of our preschool students going through our Preschool Promise program. They will get savings accounts that will follow them over the next 3 years because 60% of kids who have access to a savings account go to college. We're spending $1.3 million to wipe out medical debt for 30,000 residents because medical debt is the biggest barrier for wealth generation amongst our black citizens. And finally, we have seeded a universal basic income program. Mm-hmm. During the pandemic, the federal government's injection of cash into low-income communities showed huge benefits, and so we're trying to prolong those ARP dollars with our own local program.
Well, that was quite a list. It's a lot different than the lists I hear in Washington, and that's been a theme, and I suspect will be throughout the broadcast here. But what do you make of what's happening in town right now? The story is that we can't get along, we can't get anything done. Congress is literally on hold right now without a speaker. And we're dealing with some very pressing issues at a clearly urgent time here for our democracy, for funding our government. Does that have a spillover effect into cities like yours?
Of course it has a spillover effect. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, President Biden's ARP program, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, these are having profound impacts. Federal government legislation, federal action is having profound impacts on our local economy, on our public safety, on our housing issues, on climate. And without those federal dollars, without that leadership, we just don't have the resources necessary to fight back against these macroeconomic problems. So what you see in D.C. is the opposite of what you'll see in major American cities. It is impossible for a mayor not to be pragmatic. It is impossible for a mayor to be extreme because we are so proximate to our citizens and so proximate to the issues. No one cares if I'm spinning or obfuscating. People expect a mayor to be the moral voice of their city, to take clear, specific stands on hard issues, and most importantly, lead. And that's what we are seeing across the country, specifically in Cincinnati on racial wealth gap inequalities. And that's what we need to see more of in Washington, D.C.
Do you have a partner in the Biden administration?
We do. I'm very close with the Biden administration. Cincinnati recently got the single largest federal grant in our country's history, $1.6 billion to redo the Brent Spence Bridge, which is critically important to Cincinnati, but also critically important to interstate commerce. 3% of our GDP goes over that bridge. We're using the bipartisan infrastructure dollars to reconnect historically black communities that were destroyed by the highway development in the 50s and 60s. The CHIPS Act paved the way for Intel to make a $200 billion investment in Central Ohio, the largest semiconductor plant in our country, and we will see a massive supply chain impact in Cincinnati based on that investment. So across the board, we are seeing real impacts in Cincinnati for what's going on in D.C.
We have a new poll out today, Bloomberg and Morning Consult, that really makes clear the importance to which the economy is going to factor into this election cycle coming up here. We talk about a lot of different issues around this campaign, from reproductive rights to student loans, but the economy clearly rises to the top. I wonder if you see and feel that, and what the concerns are from people who live in Cincinnati, we talk about inflation and in the abstract. What does it mean for people in your city?
It's a real challenge. The macroeconomic factors, inflation, interest rates being so high, insurance rates being so high, construction costs being so high, it's very, very hard to get anything out of the ground right now.
Does that end up being a problem for Democrats?
I don't think so, no, because the Biden administration has passed legislation to address those issues, and by passing those pieces of legislation, Cincinnati, just our example, is seeing huge benefits from our local economy to even things like public safety. President Biden's leadership getting ARP dollars into cities literally saved Cincinnati. We would not have been able to afford to exist as a city without those ARP dollars, and so much of the negative rhetoric around police funding happening in Washington, D.C. has nothing to do with the lived reality in Cincinnati. In fact, it's President Biden and Democratic mayors across the city that are actually funding public safety.
We're spending some time here with Mayor Aftab Pureval, the Democratic mayor of Cincinnati, as part of Bloomberg's CityLab event here in Washington, D.C. What do you end up taking away from this when you see your counterparts from cities in very different parts of the country who are dealing with different realities?
How similar the issues are.
Is that right?
Every major American city and every American
the ones we're already
mayor
talking about?
Is dealing with housing shortages, is dealing with climate change, is dealing with public safety and gun violence, and is dealing with economic development in a really kind of uncertain economic period. Those issues are not unique across the country, but tailoring bespoke strategies to make an impact on your specific municipality, getting feedback from other mayors who've tried similar things on similar issues is really incredibly important.
As you look ahead to a time with the Speaker of the House, maybe some funding initiatives that go into this new year, what's the priority for Cincinnati? You've mentioned a housing shortage. Jeni Arndt from Fort Collins grabbed that as the first issue that she mentioned as well. What can Washington do when we have 8% on a 30-year mortgage? Yeah,
well, public safety will always be first, second, and third from a priority perspective for probably most American mayors. But I do think housing shortages is a real problem across the country. And more people view housing as a basic service akin to snow removal or trash pickup or fixing potholes. And unfortunately, the way our city governments are structured, we do not have the resources that a HUD does on the national level. And so having the federal government take a more active role in cracking down on institutional investors, on providing more creative solutions to rental equity. You know, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program through ARP was wildly successful. More national legislation around that, around access to housing and renters' rights is absolutely necessary. I'm really glad you could join us. Nice to meet you, Mayor Pureval. Great to have you with us here on Bloomberg Radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We're not in the normal location, as you can see on YouTube. If you want to join us, search Bloomberg Global News on YouTube. We've got cameras set up here at the Waldorf Astoria in downtown Washington for Bloomberg CityLab's 2023 event, gathering mayors and innovators from around the country. It's already brought some fascinating conversations to the program here as we go to ground in towns and cities around the country that are dealing with reality as opposed to the fantasy land that you might describe here in Washington, D.C. Now, one of the top stories today, beyond the speaker race, beyond the president's address later, and we're going to get to those as we move through the hour, Jim Jordan not standing for a third round as speaker, and President Biden will address the nation from the Oval Office at 8 p.m. Washington time. It all comes against the backdrop of new data, new polling data from Bloomberg and Morning Consult that we're going to dig into with Eli Yokley, our colleague at Morning Consult, where he's political analyst and no stranger to this broadcast. Eli, welcome back. We can call each other colleagues now, right? Because we're working on polls together, I think. That's right. It's good to be here. You're like 2 blocks away from me right now. I love this. Come by for the crab cakes later. I'll meet you in like an hour. Joe Biden, based on what I'm reading here, has a bit to worry about. And this is important, Eli. And let's start broad because we talk about national polls just about every day, I feel like, and they seem to mean less over time. Because not only are the samples in some cases questionable, but we're so early, and it really comes down to battleground states. And this poll does just that. It zeroes in on 7 battleground states that will likely decide the next president of the United States. And when you cut out the noise nationally and look at these races, Joe Biden's got some work on his hands. What do you see?
Joe Biden has a tough road ahead of him. I mean, the national polls are telling us the same thing that these state polls almost are, which this race is much closer than he wishes it would be. He's underwater in Arizona and in Georgia and in Wisconsin. These states were so important to his victory in 2020, and right now he's losing a lot of people there. That's not where you want to be a year out from Election Day, but we are about a year from Election Day, and there's time for the president to improve on some of these.
Well, let's dig into some of the numbers more specifically here and the issues, Eli, because the economy was what was supposed to be the winning issue for Joe Biden. Bidenomics, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure deal. All of those bring lower scores for Joe Biden than Donald Trump. Can you walk us through?
I mean, the headline figure to me was half of voters in all of these states combined think Bidenomics has been bad for the country's economy. His message is not winning in these swing states where he needs it to be. And that's something we've also noticed in some of our national tracking. You know, when good things happen for the economy, voters are far less likely to hear about them than they are the bad things. He's got a case to make. The problem is the voters aren't hearing about it. And on every economic issue we tested, from housing to costs, Donald Trump has an advantage. Only about a third of voters trust Joe Biden to handle those things. He's president. This is his problem right now. Donald Trump is not in office, but clearly over the next year, he's got to work to convince the American people that Bidenomics is working for him.
If it hasn't happened yet, though, Eli, I know you're not a political strategist advising the president here, but my goodness, I was talking to Rick Davis a little while ago about these numbers. You can only have so many campaign events with a hard hat and a backhoe. Is that the next year for Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, and part of it is, the ad spending really hasn't started yet. The president hasn't yet made his political case to the American people. A lot of his campaign events have been going out and raising a lot of money. The other thing is, a lot of the economic news, when it's good, it's kind of boring. It doesn't get a lot of attention. And meanwhile, you've got a hot war in Israel, a hot war in Ukraine. The national media attention is focused a lot on that. And the American people are too. And still, folks are going to the grocery store and things are expensive. And so whenever you hear about these wins of his, be it on chips, be it on infrastructure, those are like long-term policy victories that over time will yield results. That doesn't do anything about gas prices or how much it costs to buy a gallon of milk.
Well, we can go beyond the kitchen table issues here. As you point out, foreign policy is a problem as well. Trump fares better than Joe Biden on U.S.-China relations, as well as the war in Ukraine. And I don't know how much that has to do with the fact that Donald Trump has not been in office for this conflict. There's not necessarily a real comparison to be made there, but he frequently says if he were president, this never would have happened. And if he becomes president again, he could fix it and end this war in 24 hours. What do you make of that?
I think a lot of that is Donald Trump's distance from the Oval Office at this point. Honestly, I mean, Joe Biden's underwater on every issue, almost every issue we tested, except for things like climate. I think the American people have just a bad view of him at this moment. And meanwhile, Donald Trump is just not getting the same kind of attention that he used to whenever he was in the Oval Office. I think part of this is the Biden campaign will need to litigate a case against the president on these national security issues. I think the Jack Smith case involving the classified documents is a pretty clear way of doing it. The challenge has been the president has been afraid to touch it, given the Justice Department's involvement in it. But you have the former president with classified documents down at Mar-a-Lago. That seems like a pretty easy case to make for the American people not to trust the former president. But the challenge is Joe Biden is overseeing now 2 wars, and this issue is front and center for him.
We're spending time with Eli Yokley, politics analyst at Morning Consult, which helped us generate the poll that we're talking about today at Bloomberg News. In these swing states, Nevada was actually the best showing for Joe Biden among the 7 that you isolated, Eli. Is that because of organized labor on the Las Vegas Strip, or is it something I'm not thinking of?
I think probably a lot of that is. It's also a rather more diverse state than some of these other states we've tested in this survey. I mean, Joe Biden is really struggling with white voters generally, and especially among the white working class, and that's dragging him down both nationally and in some of these other states. Joe Biden is still doing okay with members of labor unions across the board. I think he has some challenges maybe in some of these states, but clearly his attrition with white people in the white working class generally is a problem for him. I mean, since 2016, Donald Trump, his Republican Party has made notable gains in terms of caring about people like me, like the classic campaign question. And a lot of that has come from white people. A lot of it has come from lower earners. And in a lot of these states, those people decide elections, and they're not siding with Joe Biden.
Before I get to some of the other issues here, I have to ask you about infrastructure. Donald Trump, it was a meme. It was a joke here in town that every week was infrastructure week. He promised it. He never got it done. Joe Biden made this his signature achievement, the biggest investment in infrastructure since FDR, we were told. And Trump has an edge on the matter of infrastructure here as we look at the data on the terminal, 42% to 38%. How do we rationalize that? Is it because these jobs haven't actually begun?
I think it's a long-term policy victory that takes a while for voters to see. And I also just think Joe Biden is getting dogged down by people not liking him. I think they've got a lot of qualms about his age, and they've got a lot of qualms about the economy. And so you ask him about just about anything, and he gets negative views from the American people and these swing state voters we talk to.
Let's talk about demographics for a moment, Eli. Joe Biden still has one point of strength here that Donald Trump could be envious of, and that's female voters. Could women save his campaign?
I think they could. I think that that's what we saw in 2022. I mean, part of what we might be seeing in this election cycle is another setup of the circumstances we saw in the midterm elections. Voters talk a lot about the economy, but there's also other issues on their minds. And the abortion issue is one where Joe Biden has a slight advantage over Donald Trump. It's one that has clearly excited the Democratic base, but he's got to fix this economy issue. I mean, in our survey we did together, women notice this a lot more, and the cost thing hits them hard. There's been political science studies on this that women notice the price of groceries because they're often the ones doing the grocery shopping. This is clearly weighing on him. He should be doing better with them than he is today.
Well, when you say fix this, the White House would say, hey, look, we've got the strongest job market in history. We've come out of the hole with COVID. We've brought inflation down, albeit not all the way to the Fed's target. What else do you want us to fix?
It's costs. I mean, it's the cost of everyday goods. It's just dragging down.
So it's finishing the job on inflation.
It is finishing the job on inflation. And look, he's seen some good numbers. I think last week's report was a good report for the president. But who was talking about the inflation report last week? We were all talking about Israel and Hamas, and some of us were talking about the speaker's race in Washington, which is really not breaking through to the American people. The good news that Joe Biden has seen on the economy just isn't breaking through to the American people. It's incumbent on his campaign with all of the money they've raised to try to tell that story next year.
What are the surprises for you here? Were they the top line numbers, Eli? You do this for a living. A lot of these numbers surprised many of us, but for a pollster, what was unexpected?
I think I was surprised to see him actually underwater in some of these states like Arizona and Georgia. We knew he wasn't popular there, but we hadn't really dug much into the numbers in terms of the head-to-head contest with President Trump. The other thing is in this survey in all these states, we tested third-party contenders generally.
I was just going to ask you about it.
That the margins really didn't change between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. It seemed that maybe Biden took more of a hit, but in terms of the distance between him and the president, generally, maybe with the exception of Nevada, actually, it did not change things dramatically. in his standing against Donald Trump.
Well, that's fascinating because you don't need me to tell you that people are working overtime and spending a lot of money to try to prevent a no-labels candidate, for instance, from running, suggesting that that could make the difference in a state like Georgia. Cornel West could even, we're told, make the difference in a state like Georgia where it could be down at 2%. You don't see it that way then. This poll does not support that.
You don't need much. I mean, that's the thing here is in these surveys, 1 point matters. I mean, ask President Hillary Clinton how Michigan and Wisconsin went for her,
well,
right?
That's right.
The good news for President Biden here is where he's struggling the most is among his former supporters from 2020. He lacks the backing of about 14% of them compared to only 9% of the attrition Donald Trump has seen since 2020. He has a chance to win these folks back, and he has a story to tell. He just needs to be able to sell it to people, and especially the people who voted for him last time. And maybe Donald Trump will help. As we get out of the Republican primary phase, he takes center stage, and President Biden's able to revive some of the same dynamics from 2020.
So give me the grain of salt then, Eli Yokley, before you leave us. How much are these numbers going to change in the next 6 months? What could they look like between now and actual election day?
Well, there's a good chunk of voters in all of these states, about 6 to 11% who say they don't know who they're supporting. And so that could make or break either side of this equation for either of these contenders because these numbers are so close. When you look at the national contest, the race is neck and neck. A lot of folks are still sitting on the sideline. The thing I'll be watching over the next year between now and election day is the Democratic enthusiasm number. Clearly Joe Biden has an enthusiasm problem. I think the question for him and his campaign is whether running against Donald Trump again will allow him to fix that problem and revive his 2020 base.
Mm-hmm. We've got a lot to learn and some time to learn it, Eli. Thank you for sharing time with us. This is going to be monthly, right? You're going to come back every month and talk to us about the latest data.
Absolutely.
I think you're not getting away without it. Eli, thank you. Eli Yokley, political analyst at Morning Consult. Find this poll. You can dig through all the crosstabs, Bloomberg.com, find it on the terminal as well with some really interesting and in some cases counterintuitive findings from the campaign trail.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Live from Bloomberg CityLab 2023 event at the Waldorf downtown. We're not in studio, as you can see. If you're with us on YouTube, search Bloomberg Global News. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. And we do have some breaking news from Capitol Hill. We've been following this all day. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons reporting now that the Republican conference meeting in the House has ended, and we still have no idea what happens from here. Jim Jordan apparently will not stand for a third vote, at least not today. And there are a lot of questions about what happens to Patrick McHenry and potential enhancement of powers there. We'll keep you posted as we learn more about it, because this is a conversation we're having today that's going to be resonating for some time. I don't know if it's resonating in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but we'll find out right now because we're joined by the mayor, Paige Cognetti. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us here at CityLab on Bloomberg.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
We'll get to all that stuff. Of course, the son of Scranton we hear about so often is going to be in everyone's living room tonight with an Oval Office address. Do you love hearing that when Joe Biden says Scranton as his hometown, even though he's lived in Delaware for so long? Is that good for business?
Absolutely. He is the son of Scranton. When you walk down the street, you're going to meet somebody. If you asked everyone whose mother's or uncle's funeral he attended in the last 40 years, he has always come back to Scranton. He really is.
So
the son
he's
of the
helped
city.
to nurture those ties
throughout the very
adult
moment
life.
he left. I mean, he really has stayed a Scrantonian. So he makes it easy on us when people ask, "Oh, is he really from Scranton?" I'm like,
yes, the answer is yes.
Go down the street and ask.
Well, he
somebody.
always drops his address in his old address when he was a kid in the stump speech. I know that's part of the deal here. So let's talk about issues for a moment, because you're here dealing with reality, and that's kind of been the theme of our program. Mayors don't have the luxury of fooling around the way lawmakers in Washington do. And so here you are to the rescue, I guess we can say, dealing with a lot of the same issues that we're talking about here in Washington, from inflation to reproductive rights, a lot of the things that voters are going to make their decisions based on in the next year. Where does Scranton fall there? And let's start with the issue of inflation. We have a new Bloomberg poll out today showing the economy is going to still be, no matter what you think, the number one issue in this campaign. Do you hear about high prices, about high costs, about gasoline now to the extent that you may have a year ago?
We don't hear it as much as a year ago, but I think that's in part because people have gotten accustomed to some of these higher prices. Food prices have gone down, thankfully. That was really rough last year. Right now, though, we've seen water and sewer increases in Scranton that are unsustainable for a lot of our families. So that is very much on people's minds. At the city, we've tried to do what we can to keep those issues out in front. We've used our rescue plan money to do things like our wage boost program, where we help small businesses increase their wages for their employees to where the market is. So let's say you're paying a factory line worker $14, but that Pennsylvania average is $18. We're going to pay you that $4. We're going to give you that $4 to you for the first year. We're going to split the difference with you the second year. Just need you to guarantee in the third year that you're going to keep that wage at that higher level. So we're trying to do some tailored programming in the city of Scranton to help people meet those costs and help keep our small businesses alive.
We've spoken to your counterparts from Cincinnati to Fort Collins to Allentown, not too far away, I suppose, over the last couple of hours, and asked them, what are the issues that people are talking to you about the most, that you're most concerned with? And there's been a steady theme, housing yes. shortage. Is Scranton any different?
It is absolutely
the top issue. We've got 8% now on a 30-year mortgage, and you don't have enough places to live.
Right, and we're continuing to see our real estate transfer tax go. There's still a lot of people buying in Scranton. Our housing prices are low relative to the rest of the country, which is a double-edged sword, right? It's good for our economy. It's good for our tax revenues. But those people that are selling, I'm not quite sure where they're going. We do have a shortage of houses. We've got, Section 8 lines that are, 800 names long.
Wow.
We have a lot of places to go. Homelessness and housing looks different in Scranton than it might in some of West Coast cities. You might not see it when you drive around, but there's a lot of people living in unsafe housing. They might have a roof over their head, but it might not be a safe place for a family to live.
So is Washington helping with this? Do you look to the governor's office? Then he looks to Washington, and is anyone answering the phone?
Absolutely, and that's what's been so great about working with the Biden administration and the Shapiro administration in Pennsylvania is we have leaders in those offices and staff that understand that we have issues. No one has the silver bullet, but we're working together with HUD, working to figure out what those programs and those grants look like to get to those solutions, build those senior housing complexes, figure out what types of development can work, some scattered site where city properties, if we can get seed funding in there and have private developers come in and either fix up houses or build new ones, get wraparound services in. It's a full court press, but the federal and state governments are actually working with local governments since the Biden administration. That's been really valuable.
When you come from Scranton and you're here in the bubble in Washington, D.C., what part of your reality do we not understand? What's your message? What are you taking people by the shoulders and telling them today?
Well, I lived here for 7 years, so that is helpful, though, because I worked at the Treasury Department during the financial crisis and am now in Scranton. So going federal to local is helpful because I can see what does and doesn't work at the local level, and it's great to be able to take it to Washington and say, I know that your intention with this white paper, this policy, it's right on in terms of what should be, but I need to help walk you through what can actually be, what a city can implement, what a small team can implement, and we work really well, I think, as mayors with the current administration in closing those gaps between the aspirational policy and the on-the-ground implementation.
We're spending time with the mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania, which you've heard about a few times on this show, the home of course, the President of the United States, Paige Cognetti. You've been to Washington, back to Scranton. Would you come back to Washington?
I love it here. It's a wonderful place. But we're very committed to Scranton. My husband has a small business.
You're supposed to say, I love my job right now.
I love my job. Oh, being mayor is the best job there is.
A lot of people have a real allergy to Washington. You don't.
You can make so much change here, but you have to listen, and that's the point, right? Is you have the ability of the federal government to give out life-changing money to cities and to families and to different programs, but you have to know how to use it, know how to allocate it. So there's very great power to do good in Washington, but you've got to be able to make it realistic.
Well, that's right.
Someday, but we're
someday.
We'll
okay.
See. We'll
in the meantime, you never stay more than 2 nights, right? You get out of town.
You got it's like Vegas, right? You got to go in and out.
I heard something about that. Yes, exactly. It's wonderful to meet you. Paige Cognetti, thank you for being part of Bloomberg CityLab. Are you dropping business cards for the rest of the day, or what's the plan?
Yeah, we're going to do a little bit more. I had a meeting on the Hill earlier, and we'll do a little bit more of that. Got to lobby for the city and make sure that we get those federal dollars
That's
that
great.
we're talking about.
Yes, of course, right. Calling up old friends and old favors, maybe. Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.